In this episode, what secrets are hidden in the city among the hills? Taldykorgan is located in the foothills of the Dzungarian Alatau on the bank of the Karatal River in the very center of the Semirechye. Climate is continental, cold winters and hot summers. Now almost 200,000 people live here. It is believed that this is a relatively young city which appeared due to immigrants in the second half of the 19th century. However, recently there have been heated debates about its more ancient history. There were really significant events that affected the history of not only this region, but also the country as a whole. This place attracted a huge number of people who had decided other people's fates. The city oasis in the middle of the steppe. What secrets does it keep? When did the chronicle of the city actually begin? Taldyk, that's how the hill fort was called, Taldyk. But of course the outlines of the settlement changed over the years. How a small village became a city. The very name of our city, Taldykorgan, is very interesting. Where did it come from? What happened to the settlers who came to these lands? Why did people come here? First, because of the pleasing conditions of life. A great history of a small city. Secrets and mysteries that have been discovered recently. Watch right now. The city in the hills. The town of Willow Groves. There are several more interpretations and translations of the name of this village. My name is Andrei Slozhin. It is the time puzzle. I'm in Taldykorgan. Researchers and historians still cannot reach common ground on when people began to live in this region for the first time. According to archaeological excavations and the work of historians, it was possible to identify that ancient people lived on the territory of the modern Taldykorgan. The writer and local historian Andrei Berezin told us about this.
Надо сказать, что Талдыкурган прожил, наверное, вот за эти...
I must say that Taldykorgan had 4 stages of its 150 years old history. We will celebrate this date in 2019.
11-19 век, это данные археологии.
According to archaeologists, in the 11th and 12th centuries, within the limits of the city of Taldykorgan, there were 2 fortresses. There are the so-called Tukuli. They were located on the Great Silk Road. In the Middle Ages, one of the major branches of the Silk Road passed through Jetesu. Through the Ili Valley, of course, there were various cities and towns. According to historians, such site or a small settlement was located exactly on this spot where modern Taldykorgan is located now.
Другая крепость была в районе нынешнего гормолзавода.
Another fortress was on the territory of the current municipal dairy plant. The most interesting fact is that the archaeological expedition that conducted excavations, well, actually it was the scientist Bershtan who in 1939 announced that there were 2 Tukuli. Alexander Bershtan managed to establish that these fortresses were fortified thoroughly. Their walls were surrounded by an earthen shaft with a thickness of up to 10 meters. The thickness of adobe walls was 5 meters. Scientists compiled a plan describing this fortification. So according to that plan, the investigated ruins of the fortification were a quadrangular structure measuring 60 by 70 meters. Later, these dilapidations were studied by another archaeologist, Karl Bypakov.
Об этом писал еще в своих книгах ученый.
This was written by a scientist, one of the best archaeologists of our time, the author of many books and a frequent visitor of our city, Karl Moldakmetovich Bypakov.
Частый гость нашего города Карл Молдахметович Байпаков. Талдык, так называлась гора.
Taldyk. That's how the hill fort was called, Taldyk.
Менялись, конечно, очертания, населенного пункта.
But of course the outlines of the settlement changed over the years. And Tinishbayev wrote that there was a Kazakh winter camp.
Казахская зимовка.
Muhamedjan Tinishbayev was born on May the 12th, 1879 in the foothills of the Zhilandi of Makanchi-Sadurovsky district of Lapsinsky county of Semirechye region. His father was a fairly wealthy man of a noble family, and he sent his son to study in a gymnasium in the city of Verny, which he graduated with honors. Tinishbayev wrote a lot of papers exploring history, including the history of this region. For example, this settlement is mentioned in his book Koksu Ruins and the City of Kailak. However, not everyone agrees that the history of the city of Taldykorgan has the right to conduct its chronology from such an ancient time.
Некоторые, так сказать, историки, значит, настолько...
Some would-be historians are so zealously defending their opinion on this wintering being the beginning of the city of Taldykorgan.
Начало.
I would say we shouldn't go too far.
Я так бы сказал, не надо.
If we are talking about the city, we need a trading area. We need religious buildings, mosques or temples, and of course the city cemetery.
Надо иметь культовые сооружения, мечети или храмы. Так, ну и, конечно, городское кладбище. Увы, когда здесь была зимовка, ничего этого нет. И надо...
Alas, when there was wintering, there was nothing of the sort. And we must confidently say that this settlement within the boundaries of our city refers to the 19th century.
Города, это значит...
This is 1868-1869, when the movement of resettlement from Siberia had begun.
Когда из Сибири началось движение переселения.
As in any city in Kazakhstan, most of the historical facts can be found in the local archive. In the municipal archive of Taldykorgan, there are many interesting documents. The main custodian of the funds of the State Archive of Taldykorgan, Shina Numukhamedova, told us about it.
Біздің архивіміз 1976 жылы салынған жеке типтік ғимарат. Біздің архивте қазіргі...
Our archive was created in 1976.
50,934 сақтау бірлігі.
Now there are over 700 funds, 250,000 units of storage.
Жеке басқармалық құжаттамалар бар, ғылыми техникалық...
Documents of different areas, managerial, scientific and technical, photo and phono documents, including personal files. This is people who were known in the region, honored residents of the city and the region. There are church records of Jatisu district that refer to 1850-1918. Entries of the registry office as well as party documents of the Soviet period. Over 80,000 documents. Especially I want to mention the Lapsinsk and Zharkand district archival materials. There are many entries in Arabic. Almost the entire history of the appearance of the city of Taldykorgan, starting from the farm of the first settlers and ending with the modern state, is carefully stored on these shelves. According to the information received, the new history of Taldykorgan as the future city began in 1868. It was during this period that the first settlers came here. Our guest is a descendant of one of the first families who came to develop the region.
На моей памяти, значит, еще рассказы моего.
I still remember the stories of my grandfather and great-grandfather. Grigory Kulik, he is my great-grandfather. I have a unique photo of 1938, on which he is with his daughters and granddaughters. There are my aunt and mother. They were among the first settlers. The active populating of the Semirechye began in the second half of the 19th century. Families mainly from Siberia and the Ukraine rushed into this region. So by 1847, there were two railway stations, Kopalskaya and Levsinskaya. As soon as the government of that time issued a decree that it is necessary to form the Semirechye region, these stations and settlements became county towns. So already in 1868, a group of settlers came from Kopal. There were 200 families. People were going to Issyk-Kul. As historians assure, this November transition was provoked by the fact that the authorities of the Kopal settlement simply put people outside the settlement, fearing that these 200 families will remain for the winter.
Интересно само название нашего города – Taldykorgan. Вот откуда оно пришло?
The very name of our city, Taldykorgan, is very interesting. Where did it come from? According to historians, there is a bunch of legends. Karatal means black willow that grows on the river banks, and Taldykorgan is a settlement among barrows.
Поселение среди курганов.
The people set off, and by mid-November they had come to Karabulak. At that time, retired Cossacks lived in Karabulak. They sheltered the settlers. Throughout the winter, the residents of Karabulak shared shelter and food with refugees. In the spring of 1869, the question arose before the settlers: should they go further or remain here? As the archives say, the cadets advised the settlers to send a small delegation to Verny with a request to settle near Karabulak, downstream of the Karatal River. Exactly where the wintering of the indigenous population was located, the settlers appealed to them with a request to settle on these lands. The locals went along.
Что людей гнало сюда? Вот эти благодатные условия.
Why did people come here? First, because of the pleasing conditions of life. According to them, when they climbed the pass, they saw a valley. It was all green. And moreover, they were not only farmers, but also hunters. Already in April 1869, permission from the authorities to settle was received. Local people were not against. The construction of the farm began. According to archival data, the first house was delivered on April the 17th. Farmstead received the name Gavrilovskoye. According to local historian Andrei Berezin, this name was given to the farm due to the fact that the delegates most likely got to see General Gavrilov in Verny.
Началось поселение под названием села Гавриловского.
The settlement under the name of the village of Gavrilovsky began. Some people began to call it by short name, Gavrilovka. Probably it was easier that way. In fact, the village was called Gavrilovskoye. It turns out, by the rules, the settlement could be called a village only when there was a church, when there was a sales area, and of course, a police station. Then they called it a village. In consequence, other settlers began to come here, so the farm began to grow gradually. There was the first street, then the second, the third, and so on. People settled and the streets were formed. There were no names, but just the first, the second, the third, and so on until the 12th. And then during the Soviet era, the streets were named. Collecting the data in the archive, our film crew found in the metric books many names of those who were born here, the descendants of the first settlers. So among the hundreds of names, the name of the Afonian family was found. At first our group did not pay much attention to it. It was the usual entry in the book. However, in the process of studying the history, an interesting fact related to this person was discovered.
Один из потомков переселенцев, первых переселенцев,
one of the descendants of the first settlers, Afonian, already living on the territory of Germany, sent memories of his grandfather. His notes.
записки.
Well, let's call his grandfather Bushin,
Который рассказывал,
who told us that he received the task from the Society of Immigrants
переселенцев получил задание
to find a fertile territory so that they could settle down.
уголок для того, чтобы
He moved toward the Karabulak.
И вот он двинулся в сторону Карабулака.
The path of the researcher of new lands ran through boundless steppes and thickets of reeds, which grew in abundance along the river bank. The traveler met there many wildfowl, peasants, ducks, hares, and wild boars. And once the beast came out about which the traveler heard only from stories.
Встреча произошла с тигром, но не стрелял. Они знали.
He met a tiger, but he did not shoot it. They knew going to this land that there are such animals here. But he told about it to his people, and then the hunters killed this tiger.
Или этого тигра.
Studying the history of any city becomes much easier and more interesting when there are old buildings. Unfortunately, they're missing in Taldykorgan. Now there is only one building in the city, which was a witness of the events of 100 years ago. There is a building in the city that was built by the merchant in the first guild, Rakhmatullah Bogubayev. It was built in 1905-1907 by the Tatar merchant Rakhmatullah Bogubayev for personal use. He specifically ordered a spruce from Kapala to build it. He lived here with his family. It was one of the most beautiful buildings of that time. According to the guide Ayjan Orazbayeva, Bogubayev actively participated in the construction of the village Gavrilovskoye. He sponsored the construction of many buildings. Local historian Andrei Berezin also confirms these words.
Мало того, что он был купцом первой гильдии, товары поступали из Китая, Турции.
He was not only the merchant of the first guild. He sold the goods from China, from Turkey. He was a great traveler. He also created a school. Bogubayev intermarried with the first mullah of Taldykorgan, and that's how a Muslim school was built here, and a Russian school also was created.
Русская школа создана.
It is also worth mentioning about the second son-in-law of Bogubayev. He was the first militiaman in this region, who, by the way, has a direct bearing on one of the first and major special operations conducted here.
Богубаев породнился еще интересной личностью нашего края.
Bogubayev intermarried with a very interesting person of our region, Chanyshev, the first policeman of the Jarkent militia.
Тем самым человеком,
It was him who led the operation to destroy Dutov. However, this kinship with a security officer still did not help the merchant to avoid the fate that befell all wealthy people at a time when the power was shifted in the region.
Богубаев на то, что у его зять
Bogubayev was not helped by the fact that his son-in-law was the first security officer. There was a struggle against the rich. He built a school, so what of it? Nevertheless, he was repressed and worked on the White Sea Canal. The Bogubayev family did not know where was their father. His relatives thought that he had disappeared without a trace, like hundreds of other wealthy people who had connections with the Cossacks and white guards in the past. However, one day a letter came to his spouse's address.
получает, и его жена получает.
His wife gets a word that she should come to Tashkent. So they went to Tashkent to their father. According to the researcher, Bogubayev died in Tashkent. It is still not clear how he could break free from exile, whether his son-in-law, the security officer, helped him, or Rakhmatullah Bogubayev was able to prove his innocence and loyalty to the new government. This mystery remained uncovered. The only material evidence of the life and activity of the merchant was this unique house. And now there is a museum in it that is dedicated to another, no less important person for history. The city of Taldykorgan is associated with the names of many famous people. One of them is poet Ilyas Jansugurov. The department of the regional newspaper, the October Flag, was located here. Then the zootechnical laboratory. And in 1984, it became a museum of the poet. Why did they choose this building? Because Ilyas Jansugurov came here for the first time in 1923. By the 90th birthday of the poet, it was decided to open the museum here. Ilyas Jansugurov was born on May 1st in 1894 near Taldykorgan, in the Aksu parish in the village number 4 of the Karatal district of Semirechye region. Until 1920, he lived in the village and worked as a shepherd. There were no schools in the village, and his father educated him. Ilyas Jansugurov was taught reading and writing by his father. His father was an educated man. In 1919, he studied in Almaty, Tashkent, and in 1925-28, he worked at the Moscow Institute of Journalism. He worked as an editor, director, and teacher. In 1934-1937, he was chairman of the Union of Writers of Kazakhstan. He wrote about 500 works. About 15 of them are poems. The most famous of them are Kulagea, Dala, and Kuishi. He wrote in all genres. He wrote poetry for children. He collected works of folk oral creativity. He collected works of Jetesu Akins. I also want to share the joyful news. 2 works of the poet were found this year. The story of Happy Jamal and the poem Kuat. They were found in the fund of rare manuscripts. They were written in Latin. I had to rewrite them in Cyrillic. Then we gave it to the media. Now they are published. Since 1922, Jansugurov was in charge of the Institute of the Enlightenment in Berny. He also used to visit Taldykorgan. His office was located in the house of Bogubayev. A poet, a writer, he was a man of talent in many spheres of art. He visited the house several times in 1923. There are about 6,000 exhibits here. In the main fund, there are about 2,000 of them. The house museum consists of 6 rooms. Each of them has its own history. That is, the poet used them personally. Among them are manuscripts, various objects, dishes, and so on. All this can be seen here in our museum. Jansugurov's fate is tragic, like the fate of thousands of other intellectuals of the Soviet era. Despite the fact that he was a member of the Russian Party of Bolsheviks, from 1934 to 1936, a communist since 1924, the poet was repressed. In 1937, the apartment of Ilyas Jansugurov in Almaty was searched. He was arrested. His case was being heard during 6 months, after which he was sentenced to death. So he became a martyr. In 1957, he was rehabilitated. Then his manuscripts and work began to be published. They shot Jansugurov on February the 26th, 1938. However, even in such a short period of life and creativity, he left a huge legacy behind him. In addition to what he wrote himself, Jansugurov also translated works of world classics such as Pushkin, Lemontov, Hugo, and many others into the Kazakh language. He was engaged in compiling textbooks for Kazakh schools, and also made a significant contribution to the development of the national poetic culture of the Kazakh people. Many people who are interested in history visit the house where he once worked, visiting the city at different times, and where now the Museum of the Poet is located. Near Bogubayev's house there was the main trading area. Life boiled here. People sold and bought, exchanged gossip and news. In the market square there were 3 drinking establishments, several canteens and shops. Later, a medical unit appeared. According to historical data, there was only one paramedic. As a rule, he treated people with herbs and suggestion, as there was simply no medication. Only by 1910, a Zemsky hospital for 10 beds was built here. So a paramedic now had a midwife and 2 nurses. Now, if we walk through Taldykorgan, there is not a single building that would have been preserved since the 1920s, 1930s. Unfortunately, the building of the Karatal Agricultural School, which was located 15 versts away from the village of Gavrilovka, was not preserved. There, the local population was taught farming and the development of grain farming in the province. Dzungarian, a famous scientist, biologist and breeder, graduated Karatal Agricultural School. He did much for the science and development of the region. In addition to scientific work, he also worked on the compilation of textbooks for children and was a member of the Commission on the Return of Kazakh Families from China. It was thanks to his efforts that 6,000 families returned to their homeland, including the village of Gavrilovka. This is the central city park of Taldykorgan. There are attractions, recreation areas and various cafes. And earlier there was an Orthodox temple here. By the way, there were 2 of them, but none of them survived to this day. But the stories associated with them are very interesting.
В этой церкви потом сделан был краеведческий музей, а впоследствии дом культуры.
In this church, the local history museum was located, and later the community center. This building is made of Tianshan spruce. The architecture was very simple. First, square, very high porch, the blocks were made of stone. Unfortunately, the wooden church was destroyed by fire. Many books about the history of the city were lost in the fire. Almost all local residents fled to the fire. The firefighters extinguished the fire for hours, but the temple could not be saved. As a result, its remains were dismantled and the logs were distributed to people for firewood. The second temple also did not survive.
Вторая церковь была построена на сегодняшней территории нашего центрального съемного базара.
The second church was built on the territory of our central green market. It was a solid building, now built of stone, burnt bricks and the addition of various materials. There was no cement. It looks like they used what the local population used to build some long-term premises, using milk and eggs. That's how it was fastened together. When they began to destroy the second church, a task was given to release the territory in one day. The bazaar needed trading houses. They were destroying it during 1 week. They could not move these stones, these bricks, even with perforators.
Ломали неделю. Перфораторами не могли сдвинуть эти камни, эти кирпичи.
In the 80s, due to the reconstruction of the bazaar and the appearance of trading houses, they had to be located somewhere. People decided to remove the church, but it was no longer a church. At first it was a warehouse. Well, as always, during the Soviet era, religious buildings became something else. And then there was a post office from one entrance and from another a radio node. The first radio node in Taldykorgan. The history of the development of the print media in this region is also quite curious. The first newspaper in the village of Gavrilovsky was published in 1914. It was one of the first newspapers published in Kazakhstan. Gavrilovsky paper. There were only 6 of them where the reader could read the bulletins of the Petrograd telephone agency. It is not clear for sure why the newspaper ceased to exist. Historians do not have an exact answer on this, only one thing is known. By 1916, there were no new issues and the inhabitants of this region had some more important business. An uprising began here. The reason was the royal decree of June the 25th, 1916, on the mobilization of aliens for rare services. In consequence, the revolution of 1917 broke out in Russia, which of course reached Semirechye.
Вот как раз собрание, первое собрание, которое решало, быть или не быть, поддержать ли временное правительство или...
There was the first meeting concerning whether to support the interim government or Bolsheviks. And this meeting was held in the church building.
Было в столице.
The situation began to get out of control. So on November the 18th, 1917, the Karatal district commissar of the provincial government was forced to telegraph to Verney about the growth of the revolutionary movement and asked to send armed forces to suppress the peasant speeches. The residents of the village of Gavrilovka gathered for rallies, demanded the convocation of a vast peasant congress in order to establish Soviet power and discuss the issue on the construction of a new life.
Во время гражданской войны белых на территории Талдыкургана не было. Военных действий.
During the civil war, there were no white armies on the territory of Taldykorgan. There were no military actions. But the red regiments were formed here, which went to Sarkand, to Lepsinsk.
К сожалению, есть такая.
Unfortunately, according to our long livers, there was a grave near this church. In the courtyard of this church, which belongs to the priest who was killed by Chekists. And now the park is located here. According to another version, the Reds were not involved in the death of the priest. As some researchers suggest, it was a planned special operation by the Whites to provoke distrust towards the Bolsheviks among the religious population of the village.
Есть версия, что это белые, значит, какие-то, значит, чтобы вызвать какое-то недовольство. В общем, застрелили.
There is a speculation that the Whites tried to cause some discontent. In general, they shot him. There was a funeral. Well, when there was another restoration and construction of the park. So everything was checked. The priest was buried with some kind of ecclesiastical riches. They wanted to find it. Nothing was found, even the burial itself. The village became a kind of headquarters for the formation of red detachments from local residents, as well as a place where military plans were discussed to counter the army of Ataman Annenkov. In addition, the village had a hospital for wounded Bolsheviks.
Замечательный врач, хирург, Николай Васильевич.
Wonderful doctor, surgeon, Nikolai Vasilievich Zhelbakov. While strictly speaking of civil war, wounded Red commanders, wounded Red guards were brought directly to Taldykorgan, or rather Gavrilovka. And Zhelbakov did the surgery, brought them back to life, healed them.
Возвращал к жизни, лечивал.
The official date for the establishment of Soviet power in the village of Gavrilovskoye is considered March the 15th, 1918. Later in May, a counter-revolutionary uprising broke out, the instigators of which were wealthy peasants and Cossacks. In response, the new government issued a decree to form a Red Guard of peasants, Kazakhs and Muslims to create a horse guards unit, confiscating houses for the fighters at the start farm of the former Vernensky police chief Porotikov, and also to offer the population of the county to surrender their weapons to the Karatal and Gavrilov warehouses. A real military confrontation was unleashed, which later will cause one of the bloodiest events in this region, the Cherkasy defense. We will tell about this in the next episodes. Despite the fact that Taldykorgan is a relatively small and young city, nevertheless, it has a rich, interesting history and a great future. My name is Andrei Slozhin. It was the Time Puzzle. See you.